Okay, there's
Hello,
Mike.
how are you?
Good. My name is Nick. I'm an aerospace engineering student here. Got a couple questions.
Awesome.
That's all right. So I'm particularly concerned about your brand of Christianity. As a Christian myself, Christian nationalism I do not agree with at all. I think it's antithetical to the values of the early church. And I think, how do you reconcile the, especially white Christians in this America, marrying politics and power with their faith in this country?
Well, there's a lot there. I've never described myself as a Christian nationalist. So I'm a Christian and a nationalist, so I've never used those two
And
things.
then right there, that and nationalist. Where in the scriptures does a Christian?
Well, thank you.
supposed
Jeremiah
to be-
29:7, demand the welfare of the nation that you are in because your welfare is tied to your nation's welfare. Let me continue. Daniel fasted and prayed for his nation. Esther and Mordecai cared for their nation. They were counsel to the king.
Right.
Nehemiah, Jeremiah, Joseph, Jacob. I could keep on going. Moses, Aaron. In fact, Moses was so political that he wrote an entire book of the Torah all about how to set up a government. It's the book of Deuteronomy. So, in fact, the Bible is an explicitly political text amongst many other things.
Now, can we interpret those texts in the light of the revelation of Christ? Because you just cited all Old Testament texts, but you have not once cited St. Paul.
Okay, yeah. If you want me to also, by the way,
Yes,
just so we are
cite St. Paul about
just-
the kingdom of heaven and the
time out.
governance.
Just so we're clear, do you think that the New Testament is greater than the Old Testament?
It is. It is
Oh,
greater
whoa,
because
whoa,
the
whoa,
revelation
whoa.
of Christ dictates how we interpret
that-
the Old Testament.
So you think that all of a sudden, like Genesis 1 is not as great just because of the New Testament?
The Old Testament was a type and shadow of the things to come, and now we live in the full revelation of Christ.
Again,
So it is by definition
that is such a
lesser.
dangerous theological.
That's not true. That's Christological
Stop.
theology.
Hold on. Of course, I believe in the resurrection, but to all of
Okay.
a sudden say that, like, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, is like somehow lesser because of the revelation of the New Testament. Christ even said, "I did not come to abolish the law of the prophets; I came to fulfill the law." In fact, he said all the laws of the prophet hang on the two teachings, Leviticus 19 and Deuteronomy 3-5. However, to use a New Testament example, as you asked, it says in 1 Timothy, pray for your leaders in authority by name that they
That's
might
great.
make
That's
righteous, great
wonderful.
decisions. I'm going to continue. Christ our Lord said, on this rock build my what?
Church.
Wrong. Ecclesia. It's not the word church.
Okay,
The word
English
church.
translations of Common Bible say church, so my bad.
Well, actually, it shouldn't, because the original Greek term says, on this rock build my government structure. Ecclesia was a secular word used in that time, which was all about the advancement of freedom and liberty, which are the two words in Greek, eleutheria and isonomia, which are the two words there. So the point being, Christ called us to be salt and light. We as Christians should change the environment that we come in contact with.
I
That's
agree
what
with that.
salt and light do. So why should we then not care about changing government to be more Christ-like?
Well, you're conflating changing government to be more Christ-like with what I was discussing was nationalistic endeavors, which is the inherent view that our nation is better than other nations.
Well, it is.
Well, God shows no partiality. So
Well, no, that's not true.
that-
God says in Revelation, I will judge the nations. God says
the
that
nations means ethnicity groups.
Well,
it doesn't mean borders of countries established.
Not necessarily. Hold on.
It does.
God says the Constitution of Israel will come at the end of the age. Borders is biblical. The entire book of Nehemiah is about building a wall around the nation of Israel. In fact, the idea of borders, the idea of sovereignty, is an explicitly biblical idea.
Yes, but Israel is no longer defined by the physical borders. It's actually defined in the
Again,
spiritual sons and daughters of God who
that's
believe in
a Catholic
Jesus.
interpretation.
That's not just Catholic.
Again, it's primarily a Catholic interpretation. I don't share it. I don't want to get into that theological
Okay,
debate.
okay.
Because we're going to get nowhere. My mind won't be changed. Your mind won't be changed. But around nationalism, why don't you tell me, and I will listen, what a Christian's role in government should or should not be?
Simple. Sermon on the Mount. Operate in that way, and that's
What does that look like in practice in America in
well.
2025?
In practice, it doesn't look like what has happened in history with Christians who have tried to establish their governance in the lands. For example, American history, slavery. Majority of white Christians supported the institution of slavery. Move on to Jim Crow.
That's actually not true.
No, that
Time
is
out.
true. That is true.
Time out. 9 out of 13 of the states, by the time of the ratification of the Constitution, were already abolishing slavery.
Now
9 out of
let's-
13.
let's move on to Jim Crow.
Time out. Slavery actually had a minority approval rating by the time of the U.S. founding. We were the second nation ever to abolish slavery because of Christianity. So let me just ask a very moral question. The Christians that got involved in the abolition of slavery, like John Quincy Adams and William Wilberforce, they did it in the name of Christ. Were they wrong?
No, but those were small minority Christians. Majority of the Christians
it was
of the time.
movements.
let's move on to Jim Crow, because
You're
majority.
moving on
No, because
it
I
was-
didn't finish my statement.
But it was
You interrupted my
Christianity that
statement.
abolished slavery.
It was a sect in Christianity that abolished it. It was a remnant of Christians who didn't go with the established order of what Christians believed.
Well, no.
We can go to Jim Crow. Let me finish the statement, please.
Okay, I mean,
in Jim Crow, majority of white Christians also supported not abolishing Jim Crow and keeping the institution. They did not support the civil rights movement. This is documented data.
Well, not supporting the Civil Rights Act and supporting Jim Crow are two completely different things.
Those go hand in hand
Well,
together.
the
in
Civil
my
Rights
opinion.
Act was a disaster. I mean, that was a terrible idea. But I mean, that's a whole separate issue. But just so we are clear, because the Civil Rights Act hyper-racialized America. We actually talk about race more after the Civil Rights Act than before. We were promised a color-bride society. We got a race-obsessed society. But just to be clear, today in America, what does a Christian properly involved in government look like?
I'm just going to say the same thing I said, the Sermon on the Mount.
Okay, but
Love
and-
your neighbor as yourself. Take others before your own needs. Feed the poor, clothe the sick, care for the widow, advocate for these values.
I agree with all that. And so, for example, to care for the poor and care for the vulnerable, abolish abortion. Right?
So abortion is another issue, but what about the living right now? Because
Yes.
you don't seem to be for raising taxes on billionaires.
Of course not. Why would I?
So if you want to legislate morality, abortion,
It's
I
not-
want to curb the sin of greed.
But so you want to curb the sin of greed
So
by
I w-
taking other people's stuff? That's pretty greedy of you.
No, it is not. It is not.
It's no coincidence that Anthony Fauci's pardon started on January 1st, 2014. This is the year the Obama administration took the four-letter agencies, they took control of Ukraine. Allegedly, Pfizer and the FDA fast-tracked approval for the mRNA vaccine. This coordinated global development wasn't just about public health, it's about power, control, and profit. And coincidentally, the media is now sounding the alarm about a new strain of bird flu, one that could spread rapidly, overwhelming our healthcare system. This is why you need the wellness company's contagion emergency kit. It includes 5 life-saving medications like ivermectin, hydroxychloroquine, Tamiflu, and a nebulizer, designed to protect you from the next global threat. Ordering is simple. Fill out a digital intake form, and your kit arrives in 1 to 2 weeks. Don't wait for the next outbreak to catch you off guard. Stay ready for the unexpected. Get $30 off at getwellwithcharlie.com and use promo code Charlie. Kits are only available to U.S. residents.
Just to be clear,
the data shows is that
raising
the
taxes-
past 40 years, the wealth in this country, the wealth inequality
Yes.
has increased, which is the top 1% has
Yes.
grabbed the wealth of the
Totally.
majority bottom.
There are reasons why that's happened, but just
Why
so
is
we
that
are
happening?
clear,
Why is that happening?
I'm happy to explain that. Just so we are clear, saying we're going to just raise tax on the billionaires, that statement, you just violated 2 out of the 10 commandments.
That's not true.
Thou shalt not steal and thou shalt not covet.
How
We're going
is
to go
that
take
stealing?
other people's money.
How is that stealing?
Because it's their money.
We live in a society that is run by taxes. How is that stealing?
Well, taxations are a form of theft, definitionally, because it's not the government's money. It is private property that you earn when the government extracts
someone
it by
breaks
force.
into your house, you call the police. When you have a fire, you call the fireman. When you want to drive, you drive on roads. When you want to mail, you use the U.S. Post Office. These are all taxes.
Yeah,
we all contribute as a society.
Of course. But
This is elementary stuff. It's not theft. How do you run a society
well, hold
without
on. What
taxes?
happens if you don't pay your taxes?
I mean, you get the law handed to you, but
Oh, okay. So therefore, so you pay taxes at gunpoint.
if you break the law, you should pay the fine.
No, exactly. That's the point. Is that taxes are not voluntary. Nor do I think they should be voluntary. You just have to be honest and say yes. At some form, the government has to forcibly take some of your money away. I agree with that. But just we're going in so many different rabbit trails. Let me ask you just like a fundamental, simple question: is that do you want to see a government that fights for Christian principles or not?
That excludes the rest of the population. If we're not living in a theocracy, no, I want equal representation. And the church doesn't need to have government in order to thrive. In fact, in suffering and humility, the church thrives.
Yeah, I mean, again, that's like totally insane, but that's fine.
How is that insane? Go look at the early church.
You want to invite persecution, is what you're saying.
I'm not inviting it, but
Yes, you do.
Christians ought to welcome it and embrace it and go through it.
Okay, but sometimes persecution results in the unjust suffering of millions of people unnecessarily. And so you should never invite evil
But
into this world.
did
We
Jesus
are
not
called-
promise that to us?
Well, did Jesus promise trials and difficult times?
Yes.
Yes, of course, but we should not invite it voluntarily. You know what that's like saying? Let's just, have no military. Everyone can invite us because persecution will make us stronger. It's such a ridiculous, abstract argument.
I mean, I don't see any scripture supporting a military for Christians.
You don't think we should have a military?
A government can have a military, but Christians.
Yeah, I mean, look, man, you got to go a lot deeper into the scriptures. You have a dangerously surface level.
You should read early
understanding.
church fathers on how they view
I
violence
have.
and the
Actually,
military.
so you want to talk about early church fathers? Tell me about St. Augustine's just war theory.
You tell me about
Tell
it.
me, you just brought up early church fathers.
No, you tell me about
Tell
it.
me about St. Augustine in the City of God, 3rd chapter, just war theory.
Well, I don't really agree with a lot of St. Augustine because
He's the most popular early
in the
church
West,
father.
in the West. But there's the East, St. Athanasius, St. Gregory of Nyssa, Origen, all these different names that you probably are not familiar with because it's in the East. But most early church fathers condemned violence for, if you're in the church, you must leave the military, quit service because you now belong to the kingdom of God, which is operates on a
Do you
different
agree
plane.
with that?
I agree that if you're a Christian, you have no reason to commit violence for any reason at all.
I think that's insane. Honestly.
Just look at the example of Jesus. Was he put on a throne or did he embrace the cross?
It says at the end of age, Jesus will come with a sword to judge.
Are you reading Revelation literally?
Yes, of course
So
I am.
he has an actual sword out of his mouth.
Yeah, I mean, like, what's your
The
contention?
interpretation that's common is Revelation, when he has a sword, that's the word dividing your soul and spirit, piercing the hearts. He's not waging war on people and killing millions of people.
That Christians should not serve in the military is your contention?
That's my belief. You don't have to believe that.
Yeah. We're going to have
But-
to get to the next question.
All right.
That's a new one. I got to be honest.
All right,
Thank you.
Thank you.